Welcome to Ride High Cowboy, the podcast that brings you the true crimes of Wyoming. So without further ado, let's saddle up and take a historical ride through the Old West. Sunday, September 24th, 1911. It was a dusky evening as Rhoda Spees and Mary Ribideau galloped away from the Red Bank Ranch cabin outside of Ten Sleep, Wyoming, owned by William Richards, president of the Red Bank Cattle Company and prior governor of the state of Wyoming. The girls, no older than 17, had been sent by the home staff to retrieve William's daughter, Edna Jenkins, from her home located a mile away in Little Canyon Creek, where she lived with her husband, Thomas Jenkins. Edna, the youngest of 3 daughters of Alice and Williams Richards, had been married for 4 months to 22-year-old Thomas Jenkins. Thomas was a civil engineer in Ogden, Utah, and married Edna in May of 1911. The wedding was a grand event, held at Edna's sister's home in Pueblo, Colorado. Upon becoming Mrs. Thomas Jenkins, Edna and her new husband settled at one of the Richard family's cabins at the Red Bank Ranch to help run the daily operations. Thomas and Edna worked on the ranch and settled into married life. Thomas thought himself lucky to have such a great relationship with his new in-laws, and Edna couldn't be happier to see her husband and father get along so well. But that fateful Sunday would change the lives of the Richard family forever. As the girls rode down towards the canyon house, as the family called it, they noticed the house was dark and lifeless. The barn door was open, a sure sign that something wasn't right. As shadows danced in the night, Mary could have sworn she saw a man running in the distance, but she couldn't be sure. The horses began acting nervously, and as the girls rode near a large tree, they noticed a bulky mass lying beneath it. Though Rhoda's horse refused to pass near it, Mary was able to pass by Rhoda and rode up to the house. As friends of Edna's, the girls were frequent visitors and knew the lay of the land. Mary was thirsty from her ride and went to the back door, where she knew she'd find 2 buckets of cold, fresh water waiting. The sun had all but disappeared into the horizon, and in the darkness Mary reached into the doorway for the ladle resting in the bucket. One bucket was empty, while the other contained stale, warm water. Something wasn't right. It wasn't like Edna to leave such an important task, such as carrying water, unfinished. As Mary rode back to Rhoda and told her of her odd findings, they decided to investigate what had the horses too spooked under that tree. Rhoda's horse continued to shy away from the bundle, but Mary's was able to approach. What she saw horrified her. A human body lay beneath the tree, cold and unmoving. Mary jumped back in horror and disgust. Certain it was a dead Indian, she and Rhoda rode away back to the Red Bank Ranch cabin as fast as they could to alert her father. Upon returning, the girls begged and pleaded with the men in the cabin to investigate, but the men seemed uninterested. Just the shadows playing tricks, they said. They thought the girls must have been mistaken, but after hours of pleading, the men finally gave in to the girls' request. A small party of nearby ranchers, including Oscar McClellan, rode out to the canyon house around 8:30 that night. In the still of the dark, the men approached the tree that the girls had described. Still lying underneath was a shadowed mass. As the men drew closer, lanterns in hand to aid in sight, they gasped. What Mary and Rhoda thought to be a dead Indian was 21-year-old Edna Jenkins. 2 gunshot wounds to her chest were visible in the lantern light, another in her left temple. Her left hand held a pistol, with another near her lifeless body. The men, shaken from the sight before them, ran towards the cabin to search for Edna's husband, Thomas. But inside, the men found him lying on a bare mattress on the bedroom floor. A gunshot to his heart was clearly visible. The men removed their hats and solemnly hung their heads. This was news that none of them wanted to bring to William. William Richards came to the Wyoming Territory in the 1870s, originally to assist his brother in surveying the southern and western borders of the new territory. Originally from Illinois, William took a liking to the area and started his own ranch in 1885. By 1889, William was appointed a Surveyor General for the Wyoming Territory. In 1894, William Richards was elected governor of the new state of Wyoming and would serve until 1899. He was best known in that time for pardoning Butch Cassidy on cattle rustling charges. He later served as an assistant commissioner and then full commissioner chief officer of the General Land Office, which today would be known as the Bureau of Land Management. By 1909, William took a position as commissioner of taxation for the state. He had done very well for himself within Wyoming and the surrounding areas, and had become well known and well connected due to his prominence. At the time his daughter's body was found, William was on a hunting trip in Du Bois, Wyoming. Upon receiving the news, he immediately raced back home, returning on September 26th. Within a few days of the coroner's review of the bodies, a report was issued declaring the gruesome deaths a murder-suicide. But William couldn't come to terms with that. Edna and Thomas were happy and in love. There was just no way that this could be the truth. The coroner's jury convened at the Red Bank Ranch the day after the discovery of Edna and Thomas, and included Oscar McClellan, whose brother was George McClellan and the treasurer and general manager for the Red Bank Cattle Company, Charles Wells, who owned a nearby ranch and was close to the family, and James Tully, the foreman of the Red Bank Cattle Company. The jury stated, "We find that the deceased, Thomas Jenkins, came to his death from a pistol-shot wound fired by his own hand, and that the deceased, Edna Jenkins, came to her death from a pistol-shot wound fired by her own hand after being shot through the lungs twice by the said Thomas Jenkins." The assumption was that after Thomas had shot himself, the powder burns from the gun had set the mattress on fire. Edna had then put out the fire with 2 gunshot wounds to her chest, grabbed the 2 guns, and ran outside, where she shot herself in the head. All this, it was presumed, brought on by a sudden and violent fight between the two. The suggestion of a potential suicide pact had also been discussed. William was in disbelief, stating, "I cannot accept this verdict. Every circumstance is at variance with premeditation on the part of either Mr. Jenkins or his wife." He spent the next 2 months conducting his own investigation. Having lived with Edna and Thomas previously, William was aware of the love they had for one another. He'd never seen them have the slightest of arguments, let alone a deadly quarrel that could have led to this. He noted that from his own investigation, he determined that the deaths must have occurred Friday, September 22nd, a full 2 days before the bodies were found. William's reasoning for this was the amount of chores that Edna had already completed. There was clean laundry laid in a basket, awaiting the ironing that Edna only did on Sundays. The bread that she had baked only once a week on Fridays that was sitting in the kitchen cooling. The table was also set for the next morning's breakfast, with the dishes already washed and set out from the previous night's dinner, a trout laid clean and sprinkled with flour waiting on the table to be cooked for breakfast. The livestock had been fed. William thought that such a fight to result in murder would have left some sort of rampage through the house, or at a minimum a disruption from the completion of the morning chores. But aside from the burned mattress, the house was in order, as though they had just both stepped away to answer the door. When asked his conclusion, William stated, "An affair of this kind cannot take place without cause, and there was absolutely no cause for suicide or any trouble between them." Letters from Edna to her beloved husband confirms that there was no trouble in paradise. She was a loving and devoted wife, and he a caring and dedicated husband. They were absolutely and positively in love with one another. Just a month earlier, Thomas had traveled out of town with a load of cattle, returning on September 16th, during which Edna wrote to him, assuring her love. Edna during this time had also written to her father, denoting the happiness she was experiencing. During his investigation, William had also discovered missing cash and jewelry in the home, the open barn door, and additional bullet holes found in the walls of the bedroom and the living room, totaling an additional 5 gunshots. He found so much evidence that coroner Dr. C. Dana Carter was forced to issue a second verdict of causation, stating that perhaps the deaths were caused by an unknown person, or multiple persons. William had discussed the bulk of his newfound evidence with his friend Willis Van Devanter, an attorney who had just been named as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. William and Willis discussed the evidence, weighing probabilities of the findings through many letters back and forth, and in those letters, William confirmed that Edna was right-handed, so a gun in her left made little sense. She also had distinctive bruising on her right shoulder, showing a thumbprint on the front of her shoulder and 4 fingerprints on the back, as though someone had grabbed her roughly and violently. The bone above her left eye was broken, though the skin was not broken, clearly from blunt force trauma of some sort. The biggest red flag was the fact that Edna had been found wearing a night robe over her nightgown that covered her chest, but the robe didn't have any bullet holes in it where her chest did. Her legs had been freshly cut and bleeding, and the ball of her toe had been torn off as though she had been running for her life through the field barefoot. But she was found wearing fully intact and undamaged night stockings. The main piece of evidence that William brought was that there was no blood where Edna's body had been found, suggesting that she had been killed elsewhere and then clothed and moved to her final resting place. The mattress where Thomas was found had been saturated with water, as well as the carpet beneath it. No blood was found in the kitchen, which Edna would have had to pass through once Thomas was dead to reach the exterior of the house, had she been the one to pull the trigger before fatally shooting herself. The water buckets, as found by Mary, had been placed back at the doorway, where there was also no blood. Had Edna been shot prior to putting the fire out, she would have left a trail of blood behind her as she left the home. In a letter that William wrote to his other daughter, Ruth, he stated that he thought the pair may have been afraid of something, acknowledging that he had left 3 large revolvers in the home with Edna before leaving for his hunting trip, though he had removed all cartridges from them, meaning that Edna or Thomas would have had to load them before being able to shoot. William also had stated in a letter to his friend Willis that the mattress had been placed on the floor in front of the window beside the bed where the two typically slept, but he had mentioned that the bed was made. Accounts from those who were at the scene the night that the bodies were found noted that the bed was bare. It's a curious contradiction. Once the coroner had revised the cause of death, an investigation took place and suspects were interviewed. Among them was Edward Payton, a local newspaper salesman and reporter. Edward was an odd man with a previous history of hospitalizations at the Wyoming Hospital for the Insane in Evanston. He was prone to fits of mental illness and seemed a perfect candidate to be a murderer. He had also been a well-known critic of William Richard, attacking him often in his articles during his race for governor, with accusations of fraud and theft, though those accusations were never proven. He was also on the scene reporting on the deaths of Edna and Thomas for the paper. Edward was arrested in October. However, a lack of material evidence and Oscar McClellan accounting for Edward's time while on the ranch, charges were never filed and Edward was released. O.K. Fullerton and Tom O'Day were the next 2 suspects to be identified. O.K. worked on the ranch doing odd jobs, and rumor had it that he had an eye for Edna. Tom was an ex-member of the Hole-in-the-Wall gang, having previously served a prison sentence for horse theft. There was an old trail that ran by the cabin that Edna and Thomas lived in that was used by nefarious men looking to get out of town quickly. Could Tom have been on that route and found the Jenkins an easy target? Perhaps O.K. had finally professed his love and been rejected by Edna. But a lack of evidence in either scenario forced the release of both men and no charges were filed. No other suspects were identified and the case grew cold. By 1912, there were still no leads, and upon receiving an invitation by the Wyoming State Engineer to Australia, William left the country. While there, he died of a heart attack. And this is where the story ends. An unsolved murder of 2 young lovers from a prominent family. A father fighting to find out what happened and dying before he could finish the search. Throughout the last 100 years, there have been many speculations as to what happened, but with little evidence and a century of time decaying what was found, there's been no conclusion. As many people have confirmed over the years, the murder-suicide theory doesn't make sense. Passionate anger to the point of murder does not leave a house unturned. And the thought of Edna having 2 gunshot wounds to her lungs running into a field after having put out a fire defies logic. One theory I've not seen speculated on was that perhaps the murders were in retaliation against William Richards. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Wyoming was a wild place with little law and a lot of crime. Though by 1911 it had calmed down, there were still outlaw gangs running wild throughout the state. William was a prominent and wealthy man who, I'm sure, had made some enemies along the way. Perhaps the murder of William's daughter was meant to send a message for something he had done in the past. Though the lack of evidence that would be present in a revenge killing, such as a note or a sign to William, makes that improbable, but not impossible. At the time, wealthy cattle barons were still disliked by many due to their previous actions taken against them, many of the smaller cattle ranches around the state. Perhaps someone was still holding a grudge. But that wouldn't explain why someone would take the time to dress Edna in her robe and stockings. Or why a gun would be left in her left hand when she was right-handed. Or why her body was moved after she was killed. From all accounts, Edna was a striking young lady. Could she have unknowingly found herself an admirer? Someone so in love with her, they'd kill? Perhaps we're looking at this wrong, and her husband Thomas had made an enemy. A dealing gone wrong, resulting in revenge? Maybe Edna was caught in the crossfire, and out of good-heartedness the killer dressed and laid her to rest in the most respectful way they could think of. Could Thomas have had a jilted lover? Maybe Mary and Rhoda committed the heinous acts for reasons unknown. We'll never know, and as of now, it seems as though time will never tell. Thank you for listening. I'm Blue, and this has been one of many stories from Ride High Cowboy.